Welcome to episode 86 of the Hard Truth About B2B E-commerce. I'm your co-host Isaiah, and I'm back with Tim.
Hey everybody, it's Timothy Peterson. It's great to see you again. Episode 86, I remember 1986. Among other things, I was in the management training program at Bloomingdale's. I was working to get a degree in college, and I was doing runway modeling part-time. If anyone can believe that, who looks at this video. This is how
I'm not sure I believe it, Tim. I'm sorry. I don't know if I...
This is how time changes things, right? This is like unbelievable to me. I at Bloomingdale's, I used to have sign-up lists, so I could say, like, do they need people for the Ralph Lauren show? And I'd say, sure, I'll do that. So it was a different world then, you know. But
now you probably have to have like 20,000 followers on like TikTok, or
you'd have to.
Yeah, you know, like you can't just like show up.
Back then, it's like sign up on the list and we'll pay $100. You know,
because it's probably hard to get people, right? It wasn't easy. There's no social media to like, you know.
It was totally different. It was like sign up lists and back room sets. It was very funny, you know. But anyway, so I want to give a couple shout outs before we pause to have our sponsor mentions. You know, we always love, thanking people for listening and watching our podcasts. So we're so happy at how engaged they are. And I want to mention a couple internal people, Nick Cobbs and Kate Dubovakova, who we're just slacking with. You know, we love our podcast. We hope you love our podcast as much. We hope you listen to every single episode. Also, I have a bunch of new people. Ray Fabic, who is a big listener. He's listened to many of our episodes. Let's see, Lisa Asbury, Joe Lewandowski, Margot Gonzalez. I'll probably have a longer list next week just to keep adding and adding. But these are folks who reach out and I talk to, and they say, oh, yeah, I've listened to a few of those. I was like, listen to more, you know. So very happy with all the enthusiasm. Now, I will quickly pause so we can dive into the meat of our podcast so that we can insert our sponsor mentions, and then I'll throw it back to Isaiah. Hello, everyone. I'd like to give you a word from our sponsors. Our first sponsor is Balance. Balance is a B2B e-commerce payment solution that works well for you and for your buyers. It offers a seamless one-click checkout for almost any payment method, including ACH, wire, checks, cards, even terms. It's used by leaders in B2B e-commerce, and it's as easy as buying a shirt from Amazon. Check them out at getbalance.com. Book a session and tell them what your needs are. They are the first dedicated payment platform for B2B e-commerce, 100% tailored to your needs. Thanks again to our sponsor, Balance. Our next sponsor is TradeCentric. TradeCentric transforms the way businesses transact by enabling punch-out, purchase order, and invoice automation solutions for over 3,000 companies around the world. Uniquely positioned at the intersection of e-commerce and e-procurement, TradeCentric helps B2B buyers connect with suppliers and automate payment, procurement processes to drive greater efficiency and user adoption of streamlined systems. Learn more at tradecentric.com. Thank you to our sponsors. Take it away.
Yeah, no, I'm excited about today's episode with Diego Barrera. I hope I say that correctly, from Zonos, who we've been working with for almost a year now. And Zonos has been a partner of ours for a while. And I think we're going to get into some really interesting topics about international commerce. And I think it's such a complex topic. We haven't really gotten that far into the weeds in this podcast. You can imagine, out of 85 episodes, that's still not enough to like get into everything, and including international. So Diego, tell us about yourself and just your background and Zonos, so people will just have some understanding.
Sure. So a bit about myself. You did get my name right, by the way, Diego Barrera. So I head up professional services at Zonos currently. And my background, really my career took off in legal technology, which had a strong both technical and compliance aspect to it. And a lot of that really did translate over to this world, and we'll probably unpack that a little later. I'm originally from Miami, Florida. I also lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as
I'm
Portland.
jealous, man. I'm jealous. We're in Boston, where it's like I think it's like -8 tomorrow.
Oh, where I'm at now in St. George, man, it's probably even better than all
Every
those
time I
places.
go to Miami, I'm like, wait, why do we live in Boston again? I feel like maybe I should rethink this. This Miami place seems pretty good.
It was pretty sweet, but maybe you just like doing tough things. So what else would you want to know? I like to take this approach of just solving challenges. I work back from a customer's end state, right? Like, what are they trying to accomplish? What's the job they're trying to do? And then I see that there's usually obstacles in between them and that. So maybe I worked at a company that sold software for legal, or a software for putting drones in enterprises, or now at Zonos, software that helps you calculate landed costs and duties and taxes. But really, before you get to that point, there's other things you need to solve for, right? Like compliance, right? E-commerce aspects, advertising, SEO, some of your world, Isaiah, and then also the technology aspects and the strategy, right? So that's really what energizes me.
I think that's why we got along so quickly, because you saw the value of, like, you know, the partnership and how, like, go to market together we could solve international faster, right? Because the tech is one piece. I think people just sometimes think, oh, you know, install this tech and it'll solve the problem, but there's usually a people, process, strategy kind of component. But before we get too deep into that, can you explain just what Zonos is for people? And I think my guess is there's probably some confusion in the market, because you have like Avalara, TaxJar, and these US centric tax compliance solutions. But what Zonos is actually very different, and it's more about going to market in other countries, especially from, like, you know, companies that maybe have a strong US presence but just have never expanded.
Yeah, I love that. So let's start high level. We get more specific, right? Super high level. We want to create trust in global trade and make it easy for folks to sell really anything wherever they want. And we do that with technology. We also do that with services. So some of the technology, you know, some of our key customer base are merchants, right? They can have an e-com store. They might need to solve, they may not know yet why they need to solve for a total landed cost. And I'd love to unpack that with you, right? But there are additional fees that, to the buyer, if you don't show transparency, they have just an awful experience. So we help provide that transparency from a technology perspective, so that everybody has a great experience and there aren't hidden fees. There are fewer returns, fewer abandoned shipments when you're going internationally, and ultimately just like solving those challenges so you have a domestic-like experience selling across the border.
I would imagine you're also compliant too, and you're not going to get like a letter from the UK or Canada.
I hope not.
Exactly. Yeah.
We don't want that. So yeah. I just had a quick question at the start too. You know, could you, if I have a business that is already multi-channel, do you have partners, or do you aid people doing online and offline in other countries, or just online?
Oh, as in if they have a physical retail store?
Yeah, I have physical stores, catalog businesses, you know, and all those sorts of things that I continue to work with as a consultant here in the US. And they also have e-commerce, you know, they're multi, right? They have all these different things happening. So what would happen if I had one of those businesses go to you saying, we want to go to, you know, to the UK? What would happen?
You know, from that perspective, it doesn't change a lot from our world in whether we're able to add value or not. It really comes down to, there are other factors that are more interesting in a business for whether we believe they'll be successful international, at least with us. And we do have examples of from everything from folks who just drop ship and all they have is a website and a brand, and then they just, like, you know, figure out the back end.
They don't make anything. Yeah, it's just like a guy that, you know.
Yeah, to people who manufacture their own widget in their own facilities, and they figured out how to scale that up. and really everything in between, resellers, right? So really, it's very flexible to whatever model you want to bring it.
Okay, great.
So tell us about, I think one of the key value props that you guys bring to the table is this concept of landed cost and personalization, but I think the landed cost in particular is just so like such a kind of neglected thing that people would just probably not think about. Because so what's like a simple example? Would it be like Canada, UK, South America? They could just walk through and what it does and why it's different of just like what would happen if you didn't use Zonos. And
yeah, I love that question. So when I started working here, I was like, what the heck is landed cost? So I like to explain it.
I didn't know about it until you guys taught me it. Like you guys taught me what landed cost is. So
I love that. Yeah. So I love to explain it more from what happens when you don't have it. Mm-hmm. So then I think that's like, what's the pain, right? So today, if you were going to sell something, let's just go with Canada. You said Canada, or really any country is similar.
Well, I think Canada's so simple, right? It's like literally there's no ocean. It's like they speak English and it's literally like, right, like 6 hours from my house, 7 hours from my house. Like literally
culturally, you sell probably pretty easily. So it's like, let's aim at Canada. And that's a super common theme. So let's say you're doing that, and just because you cross the country border, there may be duties and taxes assessed on any given product. And without calculating a landed cost at the point of checkout on a merchant site, here's the experience. Someone goes online, they buy this notebook, it was a really good notebook, they paid $30 for it, and maybe $5 shipping. But when the notebook arrived at their house, there was a knock on the door, a carrier shows up and they're like, hey, in order to hand you this notebook, you got to pay an extra $7.87. Mm-hmm. And that person may or may not choose to do that at that point in time. But they're definitely going to get caught off guard and say, well, you know what? Let's say they don't buy it. Now, what happens to the notebook? First of all, they're going to go back to that merchant and demand a refund, or they're going to pursue that through their credit card. That notebook either is returned at the expense of the sender, or destroyed, also at their expense. Now they're out that good. It crossed the border
because it's like reason. A legally imported kind of, or why would it be destroyed?
Just because it's like a low value item that's not worth like returning halfway across the world. Right, that kind of thing. There can be a lot of factors, and it'll vary by country how that decision's made. But let's just say it's not an easy, reliable equation on whether it'll come back to you or whether it'll be destroyed. So now, but either way, you're in a lose-lose situation at that point, from the point of them saying no. And Isaiah, what do you think would happen with that customer, right? With that kind of experience, right? If they had to pay, exactly.
We're definitely not an advocate of the brand after that, like
Totally. So where does Zonos come in? Now let's say you're that merchant, right? You have your website, you're marketing in Canada. That's awesome. You found your customer loaded up your item in the cart at the point of checkout. And even before, actually, when you're just browsing through the site, we can also give you an idea of duties and taxes. In other words, the fees that carrier would have collected. So the first scenario is called delivering duties unpaid, DDU. And the second scenario, the one we're talking about now, with the landed cost up front, that's called DDP. So now when they add it to cart, it's like, hey, we notice you're in a different country. Here's your price for the item. Here's your shipping fee. And then here's that $7.80-something. And that's all transparently included. And I can make the decision at that point in time as a buyer of whether I want to buy that and accept that.
You're paying for the landed cost up front. You guys handle that, but then you guys also handle international checkout and language, right? Like that's another piece too, right? There's a whole like international component too, right?
Yeah. We actually have a free product for the language part. I love this. We have a module called Zonos Hello, where you could take your e-commerce site, and let's say your site's in English and you have a visitor from Brazil. So we can greet them in their language and say, hey, we recognize you're in Brazil. We just want you to know that when you go to checkout, we're going to handle the exchange rate. We're going to handle the give you an estimate on what the duties and taxes are going to be. And if they have Zonos integrated, then here's the full landed cost. It gives them a much better experience and confidence in buying.
So do you also advise companies that you work with when it's appropriate to set up operations in a different country? So, I work with Canadian businesses too, and, they get busy enough. Usually what happens is they create an American operation. So they just are sending things, to American people from America, right? So do you also do that kind of advisory, and how do you determine these things?
100%. So that's actually fully in my team and my team's domain, right? Now we're talking
I'm glad
about,
I guessed right. I'm glad I guessed. This is good.
Oh, you nailed it. You nailed it. So we are definitely a technology company that also loves to solve those like human problems like they were talking about, right? So that's one of the human problems is like, what's the strategy behind crossing a border? One way that we do that is we use data, and actually we use like our actual customers' data. We will consult with somebody and say, how many visits are you seeing? Do you already have a pipeline of orders or not? Have you already generated interest? Or are you breaking into this market? What are the costs for your operations today? If you do your own DDP, do you have somebody who's like going on a tangent, but going out and looking up the HS code classification to determine the duties? Like, are we doing that all manually? And what we do is we can actually provide a report that tells you, hey, here's what your cost is, here's what your return is going to be, estimated on a model of you entering this region, as well as an analysis of the region itself. And think of like a top-down analysis, like how many of that good is already being sold into that region? What are the regulations and standards preventing you from, or not preventing you, but more like that you must comply with in order to operate within that region? Maybe you have a special product like food or a special material, and then that has like special rules in that one country. And how do you identify those? So that's really what we're here for, like create all that transparency, let you know upfront what you're getting into, and even help you just strategize like, oh, I should or shouldn't go into this region.
But it's usually, it sounds from what I've talked to you about, it's usually companies that they have enough brand presence where like there might even be people going to their website from Canada or South America, but they're not really operating there seriously. And it's like, hey, you're kind of like missing out on these people that are already finding you. So imagine if you put the effort to actually like go after them, market to them. It sounds like there's some of that happening, right? Where a lot of people are kind of realizing, oh, we already have some demand, like uncaptured demand, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And this is in your world, Isaiah. Like some of it can happen organically. I want to put it back on you and ask you, like, what tools are available for either front loading advertising into other regions, or even just identifying where traffic is coming from, right? Like, let's say you're working with somebody who's got their whole e-commerce set up. They may already have visibility to say, hey, I'm leaving like customers on the table here, completely unserved, that they're visiting my site from a different country.
I mean, it's pretty easy. I mean, honestly, a lot of times we see a lot of traffic from like India. India is a huge region, right? And it's pretty online. So, I mean, obviously UK, Canada. So, I mean, it's pretty easy to see the traffic sources from other countries nowadays with Google Analytics and, like you said, so many tools and data sources that like, this isn't like a crazy thing to figure out in terms of traffic. Obviously the go-to-market can be more complicated, right? Like once you're actually trying to really go into that region seriously. But what I think that's so valuable about what you guys provide is like some of our larger customers, they actually have like physical operations in the UK, like a warehouse, but these are like massive expenses, right? Like you have to build, like you have people there. Whereas like you don't need to do that. To be clear, right? With Zonos, like theoretically, you could hire Trellis to run like, some go-to-market ad campaigns and marketing and install Zonos and like basically like get your website operating in Canada, but like no physical costs are necessary, right? Like we could basically with just like digital marketing and Zonos, theoretically we could be running in like on like Magento, Shopify, BigCommerce, right? Like I want to make that clear, right? Or if I'm missing something, but that's my understanding, right? So
no, that's huge. It's super complementary with like those platforms you just mentioned, right? Like Shopify, Magento, BigCommerce, Miva, Salesforce Cloud. We also work with those. And so we have plugins and modules available. That's why I called those out. I don't know if I said WooCommerce, but really the point I'm trying to make and agree with is like if you rewound, I don't know how many years and decades, right? Like earlier, like .com days where stuff is being sold online, but not necessarily these turnkey platforms that made it so easy and simple. Now your upfront investment, now this is your world again, right? Like your upfront investment to like build that site a lot heavier, and it wasn't as turnkey. Now it's realistic. Like you can start up a store with a brand and a product very easily, very low barrier of entry. And then if you wanted to take that product across a border, to your point, like you don't need to have don't need to handle the logistics. You don't need to have a warehouse on site. You can just have all of that, outsourced.
Yeah, then you can experiment with these regions. And I think we both agreed that like, if all of a sudden you're doing 10 million in Canada, it's like, okay, maybe now it's time to get a 3PL in Canada and like get a little bit more, localized, but like you don't have to take that risk like up front, which is huge, right? I think that's part of the problem is if you don't know. I mean, I think it was even like Target that had like a disastrous Canadian expansion. I don't know. Do you guys remember that at all? It was
yeah, they did.
Like,
and part of it was retail, the physical
retail, but still, like it's just an example of like even a big company. You would think like Target Canada should be easy, right? Like they're a huge company, and like even they like spent a bunch of money and like kind of what do you remember what happened with that, Tim? They had to like wind that back or something and close
they had to wind it back, and part of it was that there were they hadn't accounted for what Canadian buyers were really interested in the physical stores and what the competitive landscape was doing. They wanted to just basically bring more of US Target into Canada.
Didn't work. But this is perfectly the example, right? You could go experiment with low cost, different options, different categories. Once you nail it down, then it's like, all right, now let's open the retail location in Canada. Instead of wasting 20 stores and millions of dollars guessing, thinking they're going to be US, but like every country is different.
And I just wanted to pick up on something that Diego had said too, because we were talking about this before we started recording, but I want our listeners to hear this. I was doing this stuff long ago enough, like I was trying to figure out the timing, but it was like 2006, 7 or 7, 8, something like that, where I was in charge of e-commerce for a health and wellness business. They were pretty big. They had a lot of different things going on. They were investing in stuff in the US. They had partners and like businesses they owned around the world, but they hadn't put e-commerce there yet. So I went to, their offices in Birmingham in the UK, and I'm like trying to figure out with their team and then I met with people in the Netherlands for their Dutch team, and then I flew to China, and that was the way you had to do it. I mean, really, there was no way that they were going to do this unless they like met with people physically and talked about what was happening, what the options were for e-commerce, right? So it's come such a long way, and Zonos is such a necessary, tool, a necessary partner for people today.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that we could get up and running in other countries fairly quickly and never actually have to be there.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Actually, would love to share a real world story of somebody we worked with that went through that. So we were approached by so we partner with a number of companies, and we work with both UPS and obviously the merchants that they ship for. And in this case, it was a company called Apotheke, and they got approached by a Grammy award-winning singer. And maybe but the ask was, hey, I'd like to be able to provide your product as part of what the places I'm going to be traveling and visiting to. She just loved all of these I believe they were scented candles was one of the products that this store made, and this very niche brand, and she just wanted to help them grow and like bring them along with her. And so
She
the
love the
ask was
brand,
basically,
right? It's like she was just like, I want to be your brand advocate. It's crazy how that,
yes, yeah,
yeah, how
what you
that
were
happens.
saying earlier, how important it is to have like that unique so like either a strong brand or a very unique
Yeah.
strong product that does really well across
I
borders.
keep imagining this is Rihanna and Fenty, but if you can't tell us, I understand. I completely understand. I did work on a project with her at one point, and it was kind of interesting.
I'm sure you could
You
Google and
know,
figure it out, but let's go. Let's keep.
That's fine. We can move
you
on.
guys
We
should,
can move on.
Google it. But
Google it.
so the takeaway is we were able to unlock 20 different countries and successfully meet this extremely aggressive deadline. It was really a matter of like weeks, and we're talking about a merchant that focused entirely on a domestic approach. And really, you don't want to turn something down like, hey, I got approached by somebody who's going to completely revolutionize my brand and my reach, but also, can I take on international, right? And we help them solve the classification, the landed cost, and really all the touch points needed to make them successful in 20 different countries.
Do you work in every country where it's legal to do business? Like, other than like North Korea, I mean, like, can I just propose a country and you'll say, sure, we'll help you? Or are there only specific regions that you focus on?
There are exceptions, but the vast majority are
Okay.
covered.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, chances are there's probably there's one of those the areas you cover is where they should probably be spending their effort, right? Like,
Yeah, I'm sure.
Stay away.
I'm sure. I'm not
Yeah,
going to North Korea right now. I mean, that's what I always use as the example. It's like, other than that, right?
do you guys usually recommend places that you feel like are easier expansion points, like Canada, UK, where it's maybe easier to ship to and get products, or is it completely depend on the business? And I mean, I'm sure there's nuances, right? But
it's nuanced. So I'd actually like to draw a scenario that maybe I hadn't considered until it just came to our doorstep, right? Just to like help answer that question. So first, yes, Canada for like US based businesses is a no-brainer in a lot of ways, but then listening to the Target example, it's not also the only expansion strategy, and you should think about how you do it. But there are maybe two prevailing strategies that we see folks being successful. We've talked already about, hey, you have a strong brand, it's your product, it's niche, your product, your widget has to go from here to here. People have to have your brand. And then another one is, what if we're moving a product from a place where we're really leveraging more like the market and economics aspect of it? So we were approached by a company with a business model of taking certain fish goods from off the coasts of Africa into places in Europe where they could basically charge a heck of a markup
they're just
that
hard to
same
get
fish.
in those regions, right? So they're rare in those regions, right? And my guess is,
Yeah, and we're talking about like tons of tuna in a high quality, high grade tuna, not the stuff in cans. We're talking about like going to a
like
restaurant.
sushi grade, high, and they can charge a crazy
Exactly.
price. Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, and then so that's a scenario where like maybe it's a lot more nuanced, right? Because entering into a certain country or exporting or importing from certain places, there's just different requirements. So it really comes down to, let's look at your strategy. What's your hypothesis? And then we'll come in and analyze that region and say, well, here's like the barriers here and here are the barriers there. We'll also say how much is already being imported into that country. Let's look at that, like what's the competitive landscape.
What's the demand? What's the natural demand? Like, already happening. Yeah. So you know what's just kind of crossing my mind that I think could be really interesting is, B2B in general, it's kind of a bit of a different beast than B2C usually, but like I would imagine that being able to sell certain machine parts, bulk items, just like high quantity, highly complex items overseas could be like a huge value prop in certain regions, right? Like I'm thinking, this is just really random, but my wife's from Albania, and like in Albania, it's a small country, so they don't have Home Depot. Like it's actually really hard for them to get like consistent construction parts. Like, let's say you want like bulk XYZ, like there's just not as many easy ways. Like there's e-commerce is like so small that I don't even think Amazon operates there. So it's just an example of like a region where like if you came in and you were like, here's like, I'm gonna get you bulk parts of like all these like common goods that maybe they're hard to get. It's like you could become like the leader in that region very quickly, right? Especially in a B2B capacity of like there is no option for that. So I could imagine something like that is actually like under tapped in a lot of like niche, like that's like fish, right? Like if you just have the mining, or I don't know, you have the ore that you have from the US that they can't get somewhere else. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like I'm just thinking of all these scenarios that like probably some other countries just can't get, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that something that you guys are seeing come up, like just kind of like as you analyze these opportunities?
Yeah, so I guess what I'm hearing is there are definitely some regions where if you could just crush it if you entered that region, right?
Yeah.
Either because of a margin play or availability, or just the rarity of your brand and the nicheness of your product. Absolutely. And I love that you highlighted like car parts and things like that. We're actually seeing a lot of success.
Car parts, I can imagine that, right? Actually, like we're like, so I'll give you another example. Like we can't get Apple laptops to Argentina easily because Argentina does not have an Apple store. So like it's a weird example of like
even in Buenos Aires, that's really interesting.
Like that's just a good example of like if you want to get an Apple product to Argentina, it's like almost double the cost of like the US. Oh. So we have a few developers in Argentina. They'll literally fly here. We'll fly like, you know, it's almost like a vacation for them. And then we'll buy them the laptop, or they'll buy the laptop, depending on the situation, here, and then just like fly it back because it's cheaper to do that. How you know, like think about how crazy that is. It's not like a tiny country either. Like it's not, you know what I mean? Like it's, so it just makes me think like if they can't get Apple products easily, imagine like car parts or like BMW parts or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And sometimes it's just you like it, there's like a gotta have it factor too. Like there's a market for classic cars from an era, from a country, right? And it stands to reason that country makes those cars. Like if you really love those, you know, those old 1920s, 1930s pickups, the really curvy, cool looking ones. If that's your jam, you're really only going to get those parts from one part of the world, you know, with any sort of reliability and at scale. So there's a lot of examples of that. And to just keep a whole industry running, you just got to get it from one part of the world.
And I would imagine the US just has such an advantage in terms of like distribution and scale. So we have access to so much of this. So the ability to like bring it other places is probably just a huge value prop that it almost feels like it's probably just barely been tapped into. Like you guys are probably just like scratching the surface. Is that kind of the feeling that you get while talking to these people, or?
100%. Yeah, it's there's more, you know, we're not really getting into this like old uber competitive landscape where like it's a very marginal world. It's more like the sky's the limit, and opening up regions for countries is what it feels like on a day-to-day.
So I want to bring up something else again, and a lot of things, you know, our listeners know this. A lot of things I bring up are related to things I've dealt with specific clients or businesses I've been with. So I've worked with a lot of apparel companies, right? And they're usually, traditionally, you know, a lot of the apparel sold in the US is made elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
It's, you know, made in Asia. It could be, you know, today a lot of stuff is made like North Africa, Ethiopia, Turkey, you know, all over the place. Vietnam.
Yeah, Turkey is actually huge. I learned that Turkey's huge for clothes. Yeah.
It's huge. But here's one of the things that came up in one of these conversations. Some of these companies want to sell the product where it's made, right? So they're making, let's say, t-shirts. They're making t-shirts in Turkey, you know, because the cotton is getting there, and then there are all of this huge manufacturing hubs for this sort of stuff, and usually gets imported to Europe and the US. They want to sell it there, you know. So it's kind of interesting in a way because that didn't happen traditionally, and now a lot of people are saying this. So do you ask those kinds of questions when you sit down with people and say, where do you make your stuff, and why aren't you selling there? Or is that like part of the conversation as well?
That's an interesting question. Well, a key detail from a regulatory perspective that'll come up is just like what's the source of all of the materials and how does that flow? So that can come into play. That would be very interesting. It's not a common theme to say someone's not successful in their own hub and they're almost exclusively successful elsewhere. So I wouldn't say that we're seeing that a whole lot by any means. The most common scenario for like profile, I would say, is someone's figured out their domestic landscape and then they're saying, hey, how do I cross these borders?
Okay. So you do provide advisory, but you're not kind of going in the direction I described. You're not saying like, where do you make it? Let's go there, right? You're letting the client come to you and say, here's what I have, and then you analyze it and see how to do it.
Yeah. Here's what I have. Here's where I'm being successful today. And what else is available. And actually, I do want to shout out and say, something we come across, and it's an opportunity for us to continue tag teaming in this area with working with folks like Trellis, is sometimes you come across someone who's excellent at their product and they found a niche, they found a market, they're being successful, and they got nothing but opportunity, even domestically, on just enhancing their own business. And like they can have very bare bones websites and they're functional. And it's honestly, it's admirable how much demand, where like I want to say there's a certain standard in experience when you're shopping online today for there to be like a very beautiful cart and a description, and you have like, marketing videos that just show you how this product's used. But then for a lot of folks, it's more like, here's a parts catalog and you got to know the exact number you need.
Well,
There's
especially in
guide.
B2B, right? I think B2B is that's why this podcast exists, right? Because
absolutely,
there are companies doing 100 million, and it's like all they have is just like type in the SKU and like there's like no information about what it is,
Yeah, and that's a good point. It is different how you market, advertise, and sell to businesses versus consumer. But I'm seeing that in both worlds, if I'm being honest. So I do see opportunities for folks to build up their own advertising, their own brand, their own marketing on their own just domestic website. And I think that would just level up everywhere, wherever they.
So you're seeing some companies that the product is so good, basically, that they're getting away with basically minimal marketing and basically having decent success, pretty much.
And bare bones websites in some cases, and they're killing it.
Yeah, but are these products that are? Would you say they're less luxuries and more like necessity kind of things, or they are luxuries, they're just so good at doing it? Or like, can you give an example of some of the categories, maybe?
Yeah, one example I'm thinking of, it's extremely niche and handmade, and this one widget, they make it better than anyone else. And it has to do it's for the art community, and sorry to be so vague, I just don't have permission to talk about this product. Otherwise,
but does it solve a problem in the art community? Like generally those people need it for that purpose? Is that because I would imagine that there's some sort of need or pain, right, where it's like, because otherwise it's harder to get away with such low level marketing,
Well, I'll take a leap and tell you about a company I know of that it may not be this company. I want to be very honest to our listeners. However, I know a lot of art related things, and there's a paper company in France that's called Arche, Arches. It is a 600-year-old company. It makes some of the finest paper in the world. They have a very specific process. It's expensive as hell. Their website, sorry friends over there, is crap. It really is no good. But they sell to businesses, they sell to individuals, they do all kinds of different things, but it is like a unique source. Nobody really makes papers exactly the way they do. They're very pulpy, or they're very thick, or they're all these special consistencies. People use it for industrial stuff. There's no other place, right? So if you want that paper, it doesn't even matter what that website looks like at this point. It's very rare to find businesses like that, but that's one I think of all the time when, like, for your example.
You guys are seeing a lot of that. But I want to circle back to what are some of the failures or the pitfalls? Like maybe it almost feels like it's too good to be true. We're like, oh, I install Zonos and then I just like am international. But like obviously like you still have to like put some effort into selling international. Like it's not just like install an app and all of a sudden you make $10 million in Canada, right? Like, I mean, there's
I can definitely tell a story that where it ended and what that pitfall was. So picture a food company that as they started to scale their operations, they just started like increase their logistics, and all of a sudden they're sending larger and larger parcels to another country. I want to say it was Australia. The country irrelevant, right? To another country, and it was going across the sea, and they reached a certain limit where they had gotten to a very high value shipment, went out overseas, and that's when they, folks at customs started asking questions like, "Whoa, hang on, this is big enough to matter." So they crossed some threshold, which is like a gray area of when someone's going to start enforcing a standard on like a food shipment requirement. So they cross this invisible line. Now there are hard defined requirements, and you can definitely find them, and you can definitely Google them and find out what those are. But if you were being successful and you hadn't run into those yet, you're just going to kind of keep pushing that envelope to the point where, well, now I put a bunch of stuff on a ship, and it was a very spendy shipment that was just destroyed because it just couldn't comply in time. And it was a food product, so there was also like a time.
So would you say that they just didn't do enough due diligence? They were too hasty, would you say, or like what do you think they should have done differently?
Absolutely. So getting back to something we talked about earlier, right? How we help folks is and on the compliance end is we look at those requirements up front, right? And we basically want you to not fear customs and crossing a border, and say, hey, look, there are some things we got to do, but let's make those easy for you. It's just having that awareness, knowing where to look and what to comply with up front, so that you can like with confidence send that huge shipment and know that it's not going to get held up.
So you feel like if you could go back in time and it was your decision, you'd be like, let's spend weeks or months like really going through this properly before we make these shipments. That's how you would have?
I had a bit of a reaction to weeks or months. I definitely would say let's spend some time, but no,
I don't know. That's what I'm saying. I don't know I don't know like what's the amount of time, right? I'm just thinking in my world, some of the stuff takes a while, right?
It'll scale to like the project, right? And like the complexity. But let's say a typical time frame, a 1 to 2 week turnaround, absolutely realistic, where you could go from like, hey, I have no idea what it takes to put my product in this part of the world, to like, I know what the labeling requirements are. I know if there's like food standard. I know if there's like an example that's pretty topical. Sometimes it's just regulations like for instance with importing into the EU with like ICS2, if you've heard of that. I could talk a bit about that, but basically it's an additional requirement.
So let's learn about that.
Tell us about ICS2.
At first I thought it was security, but because there is a security like protocol, but it's not.
There's
it's not like SOC. It is like SOC in that it's a thing you must comply with, but it's not like SOC in that it's not really built into like your company's technology stack. It's more simply put, when you're sending something from one country to another country, there's something called an HS or HTS code. Super fast definition on that. Think of like a 610 plus digit number that helps you define what anything is. So if you're watching, there's like this fabric here, this has an HS code. Absolutely everything has a code based on what it is, what it's made out of. And that helps countries identify the thing without needing to depend on language and translation and misunderstandings, right? So it's this number, that's it. So if you're importing into the EU.
This is specific to the EU or the whole world? The explanation.
So the whole world, is part of this system of harmonized codes.
Okay. Sorry.
And it will vary per country.
Yeah.
No worries. That was a great question. Yeah, it's not unique to the EU. So you're using this to go into Canada. You're
Yeah.
using this to go into anywhere in America, and definitely EU and UK. So the new requirement by these import controls, ICS2, that which I strongly recommend as a Google, is that by March, so it's super pressing. If you are a merchant that has any business in that part of the world, even if just a plane is landing and then that's not the final point of destination, you're going to introduce a lot more friction into your shipping if you don't send it with an HS code in your commercial invoice. What does that mean? If your product arrives in EU, UK, and it's missing this 6-digit code classifying what it is, then there's a strong chance that
and so what were people doing before? Because these codes existed before. You're saying this is a
That's
world.
a good question.
So why is this different, I guess, from March to before,
Sure. Like what's happening now? It can get classified on the site.
Oh, okay. So they'll look at it and say, all right, we're just going to give it a code. But now they're saying,
yes,
no, like you need to give us the code ahead of time or we're not going to take your order, basically, or shipment.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And I would say it puts the shipment at risk, right? At a much greater risk. And it's going to be enforced because it's like,
right? It makes a lot of sense because you're like, hey, look, like there's these codes. Tell us what it is so we don't have to like figure it out, right? Like, I mean,
totally.
I don't think it's like a crazy thing, but it sounds like just another example of changes that are constantly happening with compliance, right?
Yeah, 100%. And in the off chance that I just triggered fear and any of your listeners who's like, wait, hang on, I do stuff in the EU. I just want to say, head to Zonos.com. We have a couple things that we're doing for that. First, we have a free informational webinar that you could sign up for. Catch in our webinar section or in the banner. But basically, we want to inform anyone who's doing anything with the EU. Hey, here's what this is, and here's why you need to comply with it. And then separately, we also have two solutions for that. One is my team will take your catalog, classify it, and hand it back to you classified. So now you know the codes for all of your products.
Well, that's a big thing. Isn't that also a core part of your programs too? I think we never really got into that, but I remember, a while back talking about just the like international classifications. That's probably an annoying thing for companies to do. So if I had like 1,000 SKUs, I'd be like, Diego, please deal with this. I don't want to deal with this.
And I'm glad you said 1,000 SKUs. That's realistic. Think of the car part scenario, right? It gets so nuanced. It's like by year, by model, this little widget it'll probably be in the same area, but each one has its own unique classification based on like, maybe they made this one out of titanium, this one's out of aluminum and so on, right? So it gets nuanced to get to these 6-digit codes. And today what companies are doing is they have like experts people. So you got a guy or a gal who has to sit there and look up all these things on this schedule. And you can imagine how much time that'll cost and take, either if that's being done at the point of the carrier or if the merchant's taking care of that. So the solution we have for that, aside from having us just send you back a classified catalog, is programmatically via API, we can classify your products. So, at the point that at any point you want, but like, for instance, when you're bringing them into your catalog so that they're just already classified based off of the product description.
So a couple things for our listeners, because I am familiar with this stuff. I mean, it's, people think that when they code something like, oh, I have a SKU or I have there's a UPC. This is different. It's a different level and it's a different purpose and all of that. Also, people are confused sometimes about what the meaning is, right? Because there are companies that want to be in different categories. They want their product to be considered in a different category. That process is a pain in the fanny, and I don't really recommend that people ever try to do that, at least if they're a small or young company. You're probably very aware of that, Diego, but sometimes you end up in a category, it's like, well, I don't like that category. And people really...
Totally.
Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. And then what happens if you're not accurate is a good question, right?
Mhm.
With those codes. Well, one, you can have like banana description and it's batteries, right? It's like, hang on, this is completely off. Now
Yep.
customs is going to hit the brakes and say, I need to figure this out. But let's say even if you were in the ballpark and they disagree with the classification, you can just say, what's easiest is to just go with the general one, and that one likely has like a higher, like just like an overarching like
You can
union
go up a
tax.
level,
And now you're just gonna, there's an unnecessary expense added into your chain, and that can translate to like reduced conversion and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine if you get this wrong, the customs would start to like lose trust in your shipments, right? Like if they see that you keep like messing it up, and then they're like, wait, like now we're gonna check every time this company sends us stuff. Like, do you see that? Is that something that kind of happens? Because I could see that happening, right? Where
That question of that, certainly are humans working in customs. And what I mean by that is we have noticed a theme where you can, within quotes, be like, hang on, under the microscope or like flagged, say this company is going to be an issue. So there are some scenarios that either can have discretion or where they can choose to enforce more. And you definitely don't want to, you don't want to cross a threshold with them.
Well, I'll give one example from my experience, just for our listeners, and Diego, I'm sure you'll relate to this. It was related to a company doing lenses, like lenses for glasses, right? There are so many different ways to look at that, because you can have a lens at a stupid novelty pair of glasses that are useless, or, like happy 2023 New Year's glasses, or you can have ones that are like drugstore ones that are like cheap and crappy, or you keep going up and up a level till you have like scientific grade lenses or whatever. And grading these things differently, they're all looked at differently. And so it becomes very complicated. It's like, well, what lens is that? And if you start mislabeling it or whatever, you can get in a lot of trouble, because like a novelty piece of garbage versus a scientific quality lens are completely different things. I've seen businesses have some issues with that. I just wanted to bring that
it's almost
up.
like fraud, right? Like you're like, oh, bring in like the fake version of this, but in trying to pretend like it's like the high end version or something,
Yep.
right? I'm sure
Exactly.
most countries want to try and avoid that as much as they can. So yeah, no, there's so much. I feel like we keep going on this topic for for a while now, but we're kind of coming towards the end of time. Do you have like, what do you see as kind of like the future of this, right? Like it seems like we're kind of in some ways the early stages of this. Like I know you don't have like a perfect crystal ball, but if you were to kind of guess as to where you see Zonos and international commerce in 3 years or 5 years, like what do you think is going to be different?
I love that. Let me reflect on that for a second.
Yeah, take your time. It's a pretty broad question. So
I think it's like the Jetsons. We're all going to be in flying cars and
the drones, like you worked with a drone company. I don't know. Everything is going to be drones and AI driven cars. And
I'd love to answer that with drones, because I do love things that fly. I would say the future of this is we continue to reduce that barrier of entry, what we talked about earlier on, Isaiah, where it's like, hey, we started with like you had to have everything built up from scratch to like making it extremely turnkey. So what are some ways that can look, right? Today, for instance, some of the knowledge gathering when it comes down to regulatory standards, changing taxes per country, some of that has to be provided manually, because it really wasn't created in the context of like a global e-commerce or global trade system, right? So it was more like, oh, hey, if you're a big importer, just read this one document, and now you big importer, you know what to do, and that's it.
You're big, you can figure it out. Like, which is like, but what if I'm like, I'm not, Google or whatever, right?
Yeah. But there is no standard today for that transactional. What if you're just trying to send a lot of small shipments to a lot of different places, small to medium, and then scale those up? And I'm excited to see a world where those items start to become accessible through just programming interfaces. So then that will allow companies to scale up, like just plug those in and just know that it doesn't take humans. It'll reduce the cost. It'll, increase the time, increase the accuracy. And sorry, not increase the time, but like reduce the time required. Get accurate standards, regulations, changing taxes. And if I could give you a two-part answer, I would say now that we have all of this rich data about global trade, leveraging that through, I know you did mention AI, and I think that that's still new, and just starting to see like the analytics of what the data is telling us of like, hey, these products with these characteristics in these regions doing successful in this part of the world, and just having more of a holistic view of like, that AI providing upfront saying, hey, this is your strategy, this is the opportunity, making an assertion on where you should go next.
Could even imagine some sort of like image recognition, just give us all your product photos, like we'll classify them, like, like you said, like this stuff could become more and more automated, like within Zonos over time, right? Where there's less manual, right?
We already classify on images. So where are they?
Yeah, you're already doing that. Well, I don't know. Maybe like video, right? Like, who knows?
But that can only get better. Yeah, video. Okay, there we go.
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of our listeners who could take advantage of what you have to offer. A lot of people really should be thinking about this more. You're really the perfect kind of guest for us because this is not stuff that everyone is thinking about, but they should, right? You don't want to make a mistake. You want to contact Zonos or a company like you and learn, about this before you have a crisis. You want to do it when you have the opportunity, not when you have the problem.
I mean, and like you said, it's really like 2 weeks of, thought, and, don't just rush into it. Like, I think I just wanted to say this because it came to my mind when you brought the problems up earlier with that company. It's like, I feel like just in general in business, this is a very general statement. A lot of companies, they take way too long to make decisions. Like they're like, oh, should we go with Zonos? And then it takes a year to, decide on Zonos. And then they're like, all right, we need it tomorrow. It's like, make the decisions a little bit faster and spend the 2 weeks with Zonos to do it right. And don't rush. Like they take too long up front with just the decision, and then they rush the process, and the process gets, and I see this like on everything, not specifically to you, but I think it applies to like all businesses. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I'm sure you've seen that too, right? Where they're like, sales cycle 6 months, and then they sign and they expect you to be like on the call tomorrow,
Well, at the same time, we're a flexible and very dynamic team, and a big part of what we do is, let's say like a company doesn't have the engineering resources. We didn't really touch on this, but they don't have the engineering resources to implement the technology themselves. Man, we can rock and roll quickly and get sites set up with agility. So I'd say that's a strength of ours, but like you said, don't delay, call today, right?
The 800 number is across the bottom of your screen, that kind of thing. Very well done. Well, Diego Barrera at Zonos, and it's Zonos.com, correct? I just want to make sure everybody hears this because they don't necessarily see it. They're not all watching on YouTube, correct?
Zonos with a Z, Z-O-N-O-S.
Yes, not Sonos. We know Sonos.
Yeah, very similar, but with a Z, right?
Different company. You are Zonos with a Z, Z-O-N-O-S.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Diego.
Thank you.